By the time my diploma was within reach, the campus felt like a second skeleton. Familiar, supportive, and a little brittle. 9 years of molecular biology teaches you the private grammar of persistence, how to read the fatigue in a gel, how to translate the punctuation of a failed replication into the next experiment, how to keep living with a freezer that could betray you overnight. I learned to read the lab clock the way other people read calendars. Mornings were for pipetting, nights for parsing data that refused to make sense, weekends for rewriting grant applications with the exactitude of someone assembling a tiny, expensive machine. Success, for me, had been slow and surgical and utterly unpaid in applause. I didn't come from a family that handed out medals. My parents, Anna and Roberto, handed out narratives. They had a story they liked to tell about winners, who they were, how they behaved, which moments deserved the spotlight. That story had a favorite character, my younger sister, Celia. Celia had a kind of brightness that didn't need explanation. She could walk into a room and the light would tilt toward her. People smiled before she spoke. She launched businesses like small fireworks and collected congratulations like tokens. She was the family headline. I was the footnote with a long list of technical achievements. That difference taught me an economy of proof. If you want attention, bring results. If you want respect, compile citations. If you want to be visible, reduce your life to verifiable facts. Publications, conference talks, a completed dissertation. So I did. I learned to be exacting with my language and my sleep to trade spontaneity for reproducibility. I missed weddings I'd been invited to because a cell line finally behaved. I ate microwave dinners in front of lab benches and learned to memorize the hum of the incubator like a lullaby. My friends built families and backyards. I built protocols and a steady track record. There was dignity in it, and there was loneliness too. When the department called to tell me I'd be valedictorian, I felt the kind of shock that's almost physical, like someone had rearranged the furniture of my life while I was out of the room. Not because I loved applause, but because finally there was an unambiguous, undeniable number attached to everything I'd sacrificed. For 9 years, the ledger had been private. Now, it had a public total. I cried in the lab bathroom with a paper towel pressed to my face, not melodramatic, just relieved in a way that felt like surviving a winter. I imagined the graduation day a dozen ways. I pictured Anna and Roberto in the audience with their knees remarkably proud. Celia maybe in the back taking photos, the whole family concentrated into a single steady beam of attention that would finally make the shadow I'd lived in recede. It wasn't really about besting Celia. It was about being recognized for the kind of invisible labor that builds things nobody notices until they exist. Late nights, careful notes, the refusal to give up on incremental progress. I wanted to be seen as a person whose life required the same astonishment as a startup launch or a glossy ribbon cutting. There was, somewhere under the mundane lists and precise scaffolding of my life, a small, stubborn wish that my accomplishment might change the family story. I allowed myself to imagine a different narrative, where my parents learned to hold more than one kind of pride at once. That hope was dangerous and gentle. It made me human. It made the stakes of that single ceremony feel enormous, like all the invisible stitches might, at last, be obvious. I didn't know how small the auditorium could make you feel, or how loud someone else's celebration could sound when you'd been waiting your whole life for a single quiet nod. Graduation morning had the kind of hush that feels rehearsed. Soft sunlight through high windows, the distant murmur of families finding seats, the metallic scrape of chairs as people settled. I woke early, the way you do when something matters more than sleep. The robe felt both ridiculous and sacred when I pulled it over my shoulders. The mortarboard sat askew until I smoothed it down with the same careful hands I used to pipette. I checked my phone more than I needed to, because the thing I wanted most was a small proof that the people who made me were going to be there to see it. My parents had said they would come. They'd told me twice, like a promise that needed repetition to sound real. "We'll be there," Anna had written in one of those brief, efficient messages. No emojis, no flourish, just the kind of certainty I'd built my adult life around. It meant everything, and it meant nothing. everything because I'd starved for that simple presence. Nothing because promises had been flexible in our family narrative before. We were kept in our gowns while the ceremony experienced delays, the kind of technical hiccup the university handles with calm staff and muffled jokes. Everyone took it in stride. Nervous laughter, people checking each other's tassels, someone snapping photos by the stage. The auditorium smelled faintly of perfume and plastic chairs and the kind of institutional coffee that passes for hospitality. I was trying to keep my nerves steady, telling myself this was routine, when my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "We're so tired today. We don't think we can make it. We're proud of you." Just like that. 2 lines that felt like a withdrawal slip. No apology, no hint of embarrassment. "We're proud of you" landed like a courtesy, like an item in a grocery list. I typed a dozen replies, sarcastic, pleading, resigned, deleted them all, and settled on "okay." It felt safer. It felt small. I told myself they were really tired. I told myself they meant it. But while we waited for the sound system to be fixed, other things were happening in a different kind of amplified silence. An Instagram story slid across my feed. Bright afternoon light. A white tablecloth. A row of clinking champagne flutes. Bubbles catching the sun like tiny, obscene celebrations. My parents smiling in a way I knew intimately. The same smile Roberto wore when he was proud in public. The same open laugh Anna used when she wanted to be noticed. And there, at their side, was Celia. Cheeks flushed, eyes bright. The center of whatever orbit I'd been living in the shadow of. The caption was perfunctory and perfect, celebrating big news, so grateful for my people. The pictures flicked by like proof, each frame another small betrayal. My first reaction was physical. A tightness in my chest, a ringing behind my ears, the sudden awareness of my own breathing. I refreshed the story because disbelief sometimes looks like a browser glitch. It didn't disappear. I stepped into the hallway because the auditorium felt too small for the storm in my head. The noise from inside softened to a distant thrum. The corridor felt absurdly bright, tile and fluorescent light making everything too clear. I called my mother, straight to voicemail. I called my father, straight to voicemail. I sent a screenshot with a single sentence. "Are you at a champagne lunch with Celia right now?" Her reply came faster than the calls had. "This is important for your sister. You understand? We'll celebrate you later." Later. The word landed like a door closing. Not an explanation, not an apology. Just a scheduling note for my own accomplishment, as if it were a minor errand to be rescheduled. I stared at the text until my eyes watered, not from drama, but from the sense of a ledger being updated in real time. My sacrifices, 9 years tall, offset by a single table of smiling faces. I wrote back, steadier than I felt. "This is my graduation." Roberto answered with a tone that felt like a parent reading a script they'd practiced for other people's children. "Your sister's success affects all of us. This is bigger." Bigger. The word was a wedge. Bigger than my doctorate. Bigger than the solitary calculation of years and failed experiments and revisions. Bigger, as if our family's narrative had a hierarchy, and my moment was not near the top. I thought about every holiday where their laughter had been coaxed louder for Celia. Every dinner where her accomplishments were the main course, and mine a polite side. I thought with a strange, clinical clarity of the choices they were making right then. Choices that said more about who they were than any speech I could deliver. I sent one more text, a screenshot of the Instagram story with no caption, because by then the evidence felt like witness. People nearby glanced at me as if they could see the shift on my face. Someone offered a nervous smile. I put my phone away like it had been a live grenade. There was an odd mixture of humiliation and liberation. I felt exposed, like someone had opened a window in a room where I'd been trying not to notice dust. But under the humiliation was a fierce, sharp truth. They had chosen. They hadn't been too tired. They had prioritized a different kind of success, one that fit the narrative they liked better. It was a deliberate tilt of their attention. As we filed back into the auditorium and the microphone problems were sorted, the crowd buzzed with the usual pre-ceremony chatter. Plans for lunch, congratulations, the rustle of programs. I sat in my seat and felt more awake than I had been in a long time. The betrayal was a knife, yes, but also, unexpectedly, a light. It made lines clear, roles measurable. For the first time in years, the arithmetic of my life, what I had invested and what I had received, was visible in stark black and white on my phone screen. I realized then that whatever came next would no longer be about coaxing their warmth out of a reluctant heart. It would be about deciding what I would accept as accompaniment to my life. The sound in the auditorium swelled to a polite applause as someone else's name was called, and I felt a small, steadier resolve settle where hope had been. A resolve that felt like a pair of hands finding the right grip on a heavy, necessary lever. I had rehearsed the safe version of that speech until the words were almost a reflex. Grateful nods, an earnest shout-out to mentors, the practiced anecdote about that one experiment that refused to die. It was a speech that fit the frame. Neat, modest, slightly self-effacing in a way that made people smile and then forget they'd smiled. But the morning had rearranged something in me. Betrayal has the odd power of clarifying diction. It cuts away the polite scaffolding and leaves whatever is true. When they called my name, I walked to the podium on autopilot, feeling the robe brush like a familiar quilt. The stage lights turned everything into a wash. Faces melted into a single, expectant blur. I opened with what I'd written. The research mentors, the late nights, the tiny victories that add up. I could feel the room lean in, the way an audience does when it expects comfort. I let them have that for 30 seconds, then I paused in the exact space where a quiet can become loud. I want to talk about what it means to be seen, I said. Not the social media version, the version your life actually builds toward. There was a sound technician in the booth. Somewhere behind me, a channel clicked, and I felt a small private thrill at being the center of someone's attention for once on my terms. I didn't announce what I was about to do. I didn't dramatize it. I let the slide change like a punctuation mark. The first image filled the screen. A bright, sunlit brunch table, a row of champagne flutes, Celia leaning in with the kind of smile that used to steal rooms. Anna and Roberto were there, unmistakable. Everyone could see the caption. The picture was banal and precise, the kind of proof that makes denial difficult. The auditorium, which had been humming with polite energy, folded into a different quiet altogether. I watched faces register the image. Some people looked puzzled, some looked appalled. A few, closer to the stage, shifted like swimmers adjusting their weight. I felt none of the small tremor of triumph I imagined I might. What I felt was clarity, an almost clinical recognition that the story I'd been carrying was not, in fact, private anymore. Then I advanced the slides. Screenshots of text messages glared up. "We're so tired today. We don't think we can make it. We're proud of you." The blue bubble that had felt like a curt diplomatic sentence on my phone was suddenly a line in a public ledger. Beside it, the reply I'd sent and their answer. "Your sister's success affects all of us. This is bigger." The words looked ridiculous and savage when they were framed and magnified. I spoke calmly while the images arranged themselves for everyone. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," I said. "I'm here to refuse the hush that expects me to be grateful for secondhand acknowledgement." I laid out, briefly and plainly, the truth of 9 years. The missed weddings, the nights in the lab, the experiments that taught me patience the way a hard teacher does. I didn't shame them with invective. I exposed with the same methodical care I had used for my work. Documentation, timestamps, context. There's a particular kind of silence that follows exposure, one where someone's memory of themselves has to meet the evidence. It was in that silence I said what I'd been practicing in a different register. Success is a private contract you make with yourself. If you build something strong enough on the inside, you can walk across any stage without anyone's approval. Do not trade your milestones for someone else's schedule. The applause that followed felt less like consolation and more like witness. People stood slowly, not because they were told to, but because they understood. On my way off the stage, the tech booth was buzzing. I caught a glimpse of the 2 students who'd helped me switch the slides, wide-eyed, a little stunned, and then quietly smiling, as if they'd been handed a truth they hadn't expected to see in the afternoon program. I left the podium with the speech transformed and, unexpectedly, with my throat clear. The tactic had been simple and surgical. Take evidence, make it obvious, refuse to smooth over the shape of the truth. It wasn't spectacle for spectacle's sake. It was proof. And for the first time in a long time, the balance of my story was not being told by other people's selective camera angles. The messages started as a nervous tap and then became a downpour. My phone vibrated so often it felt like a second heartbeat against my thigh. Missed calls from both of them, then a string of texts that moved from incredulous to furious to frantic in the space of a few minutes. Take that down. What were you thinking? How could you humiliate us? Do you know what you've done to this family? They were shouting into pixels. The cadence of their typing betrayed them. Short, sharp bursts designed to close space, to demand immediate compliance. They were not calling to ask if I was okay. They were calling to reassert the story they'd been telling about us for years, that they set the agenda, that family optics trumped everything else. People in the crowd were still murmuring. I saw a few faces turn toward me with curiosity, sympathy, something like respect. The students who'd helped me with the slides mouthed, "Are you okay?" I nodded. My throat was thick but steady. I walked back to the microphone before anyone could stop me. The text looked alarmed and then conspiratorial, like accomplices to a small, necessary revolution. I told them to put the next slide up. My parents' messages filled the screen, raw, unfiltered. The language shifted from accusation to fear. There was something naked in their panic. It wasn't remorse, exactly, but a frantic attempt to regain control. Among the demands to remove the images, there were pleas thinly disguised as commands. Think about family. This will hurt us. There were attempts at guilt, the old playbook, and a desperate calculus about reputation and embarrassment. I read a few aloud. I labeled them the way a scientist labels a sample: fear of being exposed, fear of being held accountable. The room was quiet in a way that made every word louder. I didn't need to amplify their panic. The evidence did it for me. This isn't about humiliation, I said. It's about accountability. It's about choosing what you honor and why. My voice didn't waver. There was no moralizing flourish, no dramatic crescendo, just the blunt, factual tone I'd carried into the lab for a decade. I laid out briefly what I needed them to understand: that an apology without change is a sound without a foundation, that statements of regret meant little unless followed by actions that actually reoriented the relationship. That idea, forgiveness as earned, not owed, felt radical in a room full of people raised to smooth over discomfort. I saw a few heads nod. Someone in the back bit their lip. In that moment, the moral lesson didn't have to be loud. It simply needed to be true. I closed with something I hadn't planned, something that felt like a small, merciful verdict. You don't get to decide how I feel about what you chose, I said. But you do get to decide what you're going to do next. I'm offering you the choice to act differently. If you want my trust back, earn it. If you want to be part of my life, show up for the long haul, not just for applause. I could see the shift in their messages as they kept coming. Shorter now, more tentative. Where the first wave had been corrective, the second felt like calculation. That was the precise difference between the two. One sought to control an image, the other, perhaps, to measure consequence. When the ceremony ended, the crowd swelled out into sunlight and spilled onto the walkways. People swarmed around me. Classmates, professors, friends I'd made in the fluorescent afternoon glow of shared deadlines. They hugged me without ceremony and without needing a reason beyond the obvious. I'd done the work, and I'd refused to make my truth smaller. I turned my phone off, not out of spite, out of mercy for the part of me that had been waiting a long time to be whole. I celebrated that evening with people who had shown up without drama, the sort of friends who knew how to hold both celebration and complication at once. We drank cheap wine, laughed too loudly, and ordered takeout until someone realized it was almost dawn. For the first time in years, sleep came without the thin, prickly edge of expectation. The silence from my parents held for months. Calls went unanswered, messages piled up with formalities that tried to smooth over sharp places. When they finally reached out, the tone was different, careful, testing. They asked questions where they had once offered answers. They were learning to be curious instead of performative. It was slow, it was awkward, It was also, in its own clumsy way, a form of movement. I didn't rush to forgive. I let the actions do the talking. Small things mattered. A visit that actually lasted. Questions about my day that weren't attached to a larger narrative. A willingness to support without using my achievements as props for someone else's story. When they asked, finally, for my voice in a family event, I said yes, but on my terms. Boundaries replaced the old, unspoken expectations. Respect replaced the quiet tallying of favors. What surprised me was how little of my identity hinged on their approval once I stopped expecting it. I kept the job I'd wanted, kept the apartment with the plants that kept dying, and then somehow came back to life. Kept showing up at conferences and meetings and little dinners where people celebrated things that mattered to them. My work remained important, but it no longer had to validate me. I found other audiences, students who wrote me emails about how my paper changed the way they thought about an experiment, colleagues who sent long messages about late nights and small victories, friends who became family in the steady, non-performative way people do when they care. Looking back, the valedictory moment wasn't a triumph in the way I'd imagined as a child. It wasn't a final proof that settled everything. It was a pivot, a public accounting that forced change to be visible where it had been optional before. I didn't get everything I wanted. Some things, probably I never will. But I got the most essential thing I'd been chasing without naming it properly. The right to stand in my own life and have that fact recognized, no matter how other people chose to narrate theirs. When I tell the story now, in shorter snippets to new friends, or in the careful paragraphs to students who ask how to balance ambition and family, I leave out the petty details and keep the lesson. Build your life. Celebrate your steps. Don't wait for a seat at someone else's table to decide you're worth a place. If people walk away because you insist on that, then you'll have the freedom to build something sturdier without them. I crossed that stage in a robe and cap and a kind of exhausted dignity. I left not with vindication as noise, but with a quieter, harder thing, the knowledge that I could make my own witness. And that, strangely, was enough.